The sea was calm that morning, deceptively calm. A thin mist hung over the endless Pacific horizon, and somewhere beyond that veil of blue waited destiny itself. For the men aboard the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, it was supposed to be another day of triumph. Just 6 months earlier, they had turned Pearl Harbor into a graveyard of steel. Now, in June of 1942, the Empire sought to crush the last obstacle between them and complete dominance of the Pacific, the tiny, isolated atoll known as Midway. For Japan's high command, the plan seemed perfect. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto envisioned a trap so intricate that the American fleet would have no chance of escape. Midway would be bait, and the U.S. carriers, still smarting from Pearl Harbor, would rush to defend it. The Japanese Armada, the most powerful naval force ever assembled, would then strike with overwhelming force and erase the United States from the Pacific map. But in the shadows of this grand design, something unseen had already shifted. The Americans had cracked Japan's naval code. Hidden deep in the cryptographic rooms of Pearl Harbor, a group of young codebreakers led by Commander Joseph Rochefort had uncovered Yamamoto's plan weeks before it began. What the Japanese saw as destiny, the Americans now saw as opportunity. June 4, 1942. Dawn broke over Midway like the opening act of a tragedy. The first wave of Japanese bombers lifted off from their carriers, engines roaring over the ocean, their bombs ready to obliterate the island's airstrips and defenses. On the horizon, black dots grew larger, American Marine fighters scrambling to meet them. Below, the island's gunners fired until their barrels melted, defying the storm that rained down upon them. Midway burned, but it did not fall. Far out to sea, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz had positioned his own trap. 3 American carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the battle-scarred USS Yorktown, lay hidden beyond the horizon, waiting. Their decks were alive with motion. Pilots hurried to their planes. Mechanics worked under pressure that felt heavier than the sea itself. They didn't know it yet, but history had already begun to turn in their favor. At 7 a.m., the Japanese reconnaissance planes failed to find the American fleet in time. Communication errors, delays, and human hesitation began to weave the fabric of disaster. Meanwhile, American torpedo squadrons from the carriers had already launched, flying low, slow, and straight into the heart of the Japanese formation. They were slaughtered. Plane after plane went down in flames. Torpedoes missed their marks. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky like steel rain. Entire squadrons vanished beneath the waves. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. They had drawn the Japanese fighters, the deadly Zeros, down to sea level, leaving the skies above the carriers unguarded. And then, at 10:22 a.m., it happened. Out of the morning sun, American dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown appeared like avenging ghosts. They dived almost vertically, screaming through the clouds at nearly 240 miles per hour. The Japanese ships below were caught mid-resupply, decks cluttered with refueling hoses, fuel lines exposed, bombs stacked in preparation for the next wave. 6 minutes. That's all it took to change the course of the Pacific War. The first bombs hit Kaga amidships, igniting her hangar deck in an instant inferno. A heartbeat later, Akagi took a direct hit near her command tower, the explosion tearing through her fuel tanks and detonating the torpedoes stored below. Soryu followed, struck 3 times. Her flight deck shattered, flames roaring skyward. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's proudest carriers were engulfed in fire. Sailors ran screaming across burning decks. Pilots who moments ago had been preparing to launch found themselves trapped behind walls of flame. Officers tried to maintain order, but the ships were already doomed. The Pacific swallowed their screams as explosions tore each vessel apart. By noon, only 1 Japanese carrier remained. Hiryu. Her commander, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, refused to surrender the sea. He launched a desperate counterstrike, managing to hit and cripple the USS Yorktown. But the reprisal came swift. That afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu as well. 2 direct hits sealed her fate. Yamaguchi went down with his ship, saluting as flames consumed the bridge. By sunset, the once invincible Japanese carrier force, the very heart of the Imperial Navy, had been annihilated. More than 3,000 men were dead or lost at sea. 4 fleet carriers lay beneath the waves, and with them, the illusion of Japan's invincibility. The ocean, now silent, reflected only smoke and wreckage. Oil burned on the surface, spreading like a black mirror of the Empire's fading dreams. Survivors clung to debris, watching the horizon darken. Some prayed. Others simply stared in disbelief, realizing that they had witnessed the moment Japan's tide had begun to turn backward. For the Americans, the victory was as stunning as it was costly. Nearly half their attacking aircraft had been destroyed. The Yorktown would later sink from submarine attack. But none of that mattered. The impossible had been achieved. The hunters had become the hunted. In Tokyo, the news arrived like a whisper wrapped in disbelief. The naval staff tried to conceal the full scale of the defeat, but whispers spread through the corridors of power. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was silent for a long time when he learned what had happened. He knew instantly the war could no longer be won. He had warned his government before the war. For 6 months, I can run wild. After that, I have no expectation of success. Now, 6 months had passed almost to the day. Midway was not just a battle. It was a mirror that reflected the limits of ambition, the arrogance of perfection, and the cost of underestimating an enemy's will to fight. The Japanese fleet, once unstoppable, was now crippled beyond recovery. The Americans had seized the initiative, and from that moment on, the Empire would be forced onto the defensive. One island, one battle, one sacrifice at a time. The survivors of the Japanese carriers spoke later of the silence that followed the inferno, a silence so deep it seemed to echo across the sea. We had seen the end of our empire, one recalled. We just didn't know it yet. Beneath the waves, thousands of men rested in steel coffins, entombed in the ocean they had believed would deliver them glory. The fire that had consumed their ships now burned only in memory. But above it all, the wind carried something else, a change in the rhythm of war itself. The Pacific, once ruled by the rising sun, had tilted. The tide that had surged so far east was now receding, pulled back by the weight of those 6 minutes that rewrote history. From that day forward, Japan would never again launch an offensive on such scale. The age of Japanese naval supremacy had ended not in defeat, but in revelation, that the path they had chosen could lead only to ruin. And yet, amid the ruins of ambition, something endured. The courage of those men, pilots, sailors, officers, who fought not for conquest but for duty, who faced the impossible and went down with dignity. Their story was not one of villains and heroes, but of humanity caught in the storm of history. 6 minutes. That's all it took. 6 minutes to lose 4 carriers. 6 minutes to shift the balance of the Pacific. 6 minutes to mark the point of no return. When the fires died and the sea reclaimed its dead, the Pacific grew quiet again. But beneath its calm surface, the echoes of Midway still linger, a reminder that fate, like the sea, can turn in an instant. But history does not end with explosions. It continues in the silence that follows. In the days after Midway, the Pacific became a vast graveyard of twisted steel and drifting wreckage. The sun rose over an ocean that no longer belonged to the Empire. Rescue ships moved cautiously through the debris fields, pulling oil-soaked men from the sea. Dazed, burned, and silent. Some wept quietly as they were lifted aboard. Others stared blankly at the horizon, unable to comprehend that everything they had fought for had vanished in less than a morning. Admiral Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier task force, survived the disaster but never escaped its shadow. He had been one of Japan's most respected officers, the man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yet now his once unshakable confidence was gone. Reports from survivors described him as pale, distant, speaking in short, fractured sentences. He had followed every rule, every procedure, and still, the gods of war had turned against him. The Imperial Navy, which had once ruled the Pacific with an iron will, suddenly found itself adrift. The loss of 4 carriers meant more than the destruction of ships. It meant the loss of hundreds of veteran pilots, men who could not be replaced. Japan's training programs were long and meticulous, producing elite aviators after years of preparation. The Americans, in contrast, could train pilots in months and replace aircraft at a rate Japan could not imagine. The industrial tide had begun to rise, and it was unstoppable. Back in Tokyo, Yamamoto faced the impossible task of explaining Midway to the emperor. The meeting was brief, quiet, and heavy with unspoken truth. The official report softened the scale of the loss, but everyone in the room understood the reality. The spearhead of Japan's naval power had been shattered. Yamamoto bowed deeply, then walked out into the summer rain, his mind already haunted by what the future would demand of him. He would die less than a year later, shot down by American fighters during an inspection flight, a direct result of the code-breaking that had doomed Midway. Fate had come full circle. For the United States, the mood was one of cautious triumph. The victory at Midway was celebrated across America, yet behind the headlines, few realized how close it had come to disaster. The American carriers had acted on limited intelligence, their strikes launched with courage and desperation more than certainty. One wrong turn, one delay, one cloud bank in the wrong place, and history might have been written differently. But luck favors the prepared. And at Midway, preparation met opportunity in perfect harmony. In the weeks that followed, divers and reconnaissance planes surveyed the watery graves of the Japanese fleet. The scale of destruction was beyond comprehension. Kaga's hull lay cracked open on the seabed, her hangar deck twisted into a molten sculpture of war. Akagi rested on her side, her once proud rising sun flag still faintly visible through layers of corrosion and silt. Schools of fish drifted through silent corridors where sailors had once shouted commands. The ocean had claimed its trophies, turning machines of war into monuments of peace. Yet the psychological impact of Midway went far beyond the battlefield. It shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility that had terrified the world since 1941. The Empire had struck at Pearl Harbor, at the Philippines, at Singapore, always advancing, always victorious. But at Midway, it had finally met a force it could not outthink, outfight, or outlast. The Americans, too, understood that Midway was not the end, but the beginning of something far greater. It marked the first time since the start of the war that they had seized the initiative. From now on, they would push forward, island by island, wave by wave, until the rising sun sank into the sea. For the men who had fought there, however, Midway was not a map or a strategy. It was a memory burned into their souls. Pilots who had survived the dive bombing runs spoke of the smell of burning oil, of the shock waves that shook their planes, of the brief flashes of faces on enemy decks before the flames consumed them. Japanese survivors remembered the chaos, the heat so intense that paint peeled from steel, and the helplessness of watching friends vanish in explosions too bright to look at. War has no true victors, only survivors. As months passed, letters from Midway veterans reached families across Japan. Some were written before the battle, sealed with words of hope and duty. Others were never sent, recovered later from wreckage or pockets of the dead. "If I should not return," one pilot wrote, "know that I flew with honor and that I did not fear the sea." His handwriting trembled, but his conviction did not. In the United States, the fallen were honored as heroes. Newspapers printed the names of the pilots who had never come back, and mothers received telegrams that began with the same cold phrase, "The Navy Department regrets to inform you." Yet through that grief emerged a sense of purpose. The sacrifice at Midway gave the nation belief. The belief that the tide could be turned, that the enemy could bleed, and that victory, though distant, was possible. By the end of 1942, the ripple of Midway had reached every corner of the Pacific. Japan's expansion halted. The battles of Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, and the Coral Sea followed, each one grinding down the remnants of Japan's once mighty fleet. What began in 6 minutes of chaos became a slow-motion collapse of an empire built on illusion. In Japan, propaganda continued to proclaim strength and faith in victory, But the tone had changed. The once triumphant marches grew quieter, the posters less confident. Behind closed doors, officers spoke in whispers about fuel shortages, about the loss of trained pilots, about a war that was slipping through their fingers. And always, someone would mention Midway, not aloud, but as a ghost that haunted every conversation. Years later, when survivors gathered to remember the battle, they spoke not of glory, but of lessons. One Japanese officer said softly, "At Midway, we believed we were invincible. That belief blinded us." An American pilot replied, "We believed we couldn't win. That fear pushed us." Between them stretched an ocean, and an understanding only those who had seen war as heart could share. The Pacific, once painted in the bright colors of empire, had turned gray. The waves rolled endlessly over the places where ships had burned and men had died. The seabed became a quiet museum of ambition and sacrifice, steel bones resting in eternal silence. Midway was more than a battle. It was the moment when fate changed its allegiance, when pride became downfall, and when the course of human history bent toward a new horizon. Every war has its turning point, a heartbeat where time seems to split. For the Pacific, that heartbeat lasted 6 minutes. And as the years passed, as peace returned and the world began to rebuild, the story of Midway became legend. Historians debated tactics, generals wrote reports, filmmakers told stories. But those who had been there remembered something simpler: the smell of salt, the taste of fear, the sound of engines roaring into the sun, and the sudden silence when it was all over. The men who fought at Midway, American and Japanese alike, did not choose their fate, but they faced it with the courage that defines humanity's best and worst moments. Their legacy is not in victory or defeat, but in the reminder that even the most powerful can fall, and even the most hopeless can rise. The sea remembers. It always remembers. And somewhere beneath those endless waves, the ghosts of Midway still drift, carried by the current, whispering the same truth to every generation that dares to forget. History can change in 6 minutes.